Also today, do we need more drilling for oil in the Sussex and Surrey countryside in an era of moves towards renewable sources like wind and solar? When it comes to removing and using any oil we need, would it be better not to drill for it close to where we live? That follows the news that an application for 4 more oil wells at the Horse Hill site near Hawley were postponed yesterday. Having said that, oil wells have been operating in that area of Surrey for many years. So what do you think on that one? Give me a call.
0800 232 1045.
So as always, I'm asking whether we need more drilling for oil in the Sussex and Surrey countryside. A decision on oil drilling yesterday was postponed for 4 oil wells because of thousands of objections which have been received. The application for the Horse Hill well site near Hookwood at Hawley was due to be considered in April, but due to the sheer amount of papers that officers have to consult with statutory bodies over and sort out, the decision-making meeting has been put off until May. So as we move toward more renewable sources like wind and solar, do we need more oil drilling in Sussex and Surrey? As Brian from Littlehampton said when he called us earlier, he said, look, we've still got industries that run on the products of oil, so can we get rid of it? Well, no, we can't, not while those industries are running, Brian, but does it need to come from near where people live? There's quite a lot of North Sea around, isn't there? It's just, what's your thoughts on this? Get in touch, 81333 on the text, start your message with radio, or give us a call.
Call BBC Sussex
0800 232 1045.
So first of all, let's check in with BBC Surrey's political reporter Jack Feen. So the background to this Horse Hill site and these applications, the decision over which has been postponed.
Yes, I mean, well, a few years ago, what happened is that the company UK Oil and Gas, who'd been looking at this site at Horse Hill near Gatwick, said there were signs that there was a significant amount of oil, and that perhaps as much as 158 million barrels per square mile. Now, that's a figure that some experts at the time were quite sceptical of. But the most recent development, Danny, was in February when the company said in the previous 6 months that the tests they'd done had produced around 30,000 barrels of oil, so they've been having success at the site, is what they're saying. And what they now want to do is to drill up to 4 new wells, and they've put in this planning application to Surrey County Council. So that's kind of where they are and where we are at the moment in terms of what's going on at Horse Hill.
And that's on the same site that's already there at the moment, is it?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Because if you look at it from Google Maps, it's a tiny site when you compare it to the size of Gatwick Airport just a couple of miles to the south.
Well, this is, and what they've said is that in theory, that it's this whole part of the Weald, this whole part of Sussex and Surrey, crossing over to Hampshire and Kent, the Weald has in theory this significant amount of oil that is there under the ground. Now, but obviously, when this whole subject of drilling for oil creates very strong feeling, and what you've got in the sense of this application, because of course they've had put in this application as part of the planning process, and what Surrey is saying is that they're getting thousands of comments, that there's more coming in every day. So, as you were saying, that this, because of the sheer amount of comments and papers that the officers are having to deal with, this meeting that they were going to hold next month has now been put off until May. And as I say, there are lots of concerns. Campaigners and residents have expressed fears about things like leaks and water contamination, and also the extra oil tankers on the road. Now, last month, BBC Sussex and BBC Surrey spoke to the chief executive of UK Oil and Gas, who managed this site. That's Stephen Sanderson, and he says they do all they can to talk to local residents.
We've shown them everything that we're doing. We've answered their questions. We have a lot of engagement locally. We're primarily concerned, of course, with the people that live immediately around the site. I think they've gone away quite happy, but you'd have to ask them what they feel. But generally, UKOG has taken quite a lead in the industry for engaging with the local community. So we plan to be here for a long time, so it's important that, we have a good relationship for them. And I think it's also worth mentioning that we voluntarily will plan to give around 6% of our revenues, gross revenues, to the local community, which will be business rate taxes and a royalty. I think if you come to the site, you'll see that there's very minimal visual impact. We take a lead in the way that we conduct our operations. And I think the Environment Agency would say that we probably lead the field in the UK onshore.
That's Stephen Sanderson from UK Oil and Gas, who want to have more oil wells near Gatwick. And this isn't the only site in our area that's been controversial, Jack.
No, Danny. I mean, the one I suppose that jumps immediately to my mind is a few. In the last few years, the company Europa Oil and Gas has wanted to do some exploratory drilling in the Surrey Hills at Leith Hill, near Cold Harbour, the village of Cold Harbour. And again, this was extremely controversial, a process which took years, until the point that eventually the company, going through the planning process, withdrew its application altogether. But just to give you an idea of the extremity that people and campaigners go to, some of the protesters got onto that site, and they dug holes, and they build this Aztec style fort, in the middle of it, in order to hold up the whole process. I mean, that Aztec style fort, you'll see pictures online, is still one of the most extraordinary things that I've seen people build as part of a protest in my time as a reporter. But some of the issues that one rose, that the Leith Hill application brought up, as well as the one at Horse Hill, it's the same arguments time and time again. You have people worried about the environmental impact, on the impact on water, what happens when there's drilling, and what that impact. Of course, in Surrey, there have been a number of earthquakes over the last couple of years, and the campaigners believe there is a link to the oil drilling. With that, there is a concern that down the line that this will all ultimately lead to fracking, that it won't be conventional oil drilling, that there will be fracking. The company say that isn't the case, that this is not fracking, that they have no intention to frack. They also say they've also ruled out this link to the earthquakes. They point out that drilling for oil in Surrey has been going on for decades. You can see Pathé newsreels of oil companies drilling in Surrey, back in the 1950s. And there's also, I think, this debate about, where we get our energy from. A lot of it is exported from countries like Russia and the Middle East. And I think the company's argument is that given that there is this natural resource here in the UK, here in the southeast, should we not utilise that?
Jack Feen, our BBC Surrey political reporter, thank you. Lisa Scott lives near the site. They're near Hawley and campaigns against oil drilling in the area. Hi, Lisa.
Hello there. Hi, how are you this morning?
Very well. Thanks for joining us today. So have you made an objection to this plan for the 4 new wells?
I have, but it's difficult because the longer we have to study the documents, the more issues we've been coming up with the documents, and obviously the more earthquakes we're going through as well. The documents went in December. There's 97, I believe, on the council site. There's a huge amount to trawl through, so no wonder Surrey are needing extra time to review these and identify the raft of inconsistencies that there are.
And what's your main objection, Lisa?
My main objection is on climate breakdown grounds. We need to be reducing the use of hydrocarbons and moving over to renewables. People want to do that. People recognise the need to move immediately to sustainable living. And the number of people that now cycle around whenever they can rather than getting in their cars, the number of people cycling...
It's tiny compared to the people who are still driving, though, isn't it? I mean, cycling is not the cure for this, is it?
It is, but if people were to feel safe when they were on the roads, then many, many more people are actually willing, and part of it is down to the law at the moment when car drivers do own the road. Many car drivers are good. Car drivers are getting better, and people do feel safer riding on the roads. But it's a process that we need to go through.
Can I ask you this, Lisa? What's it like to live near the Horse Hill site? Because it's way back off the road. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't necessarily spot it. So what's it like to live nearby?
It used to be a field. It's now blatantly obvious when you drive up Horse Hill Road that there's like an industrial site there. It's covered in porter cabins. At night time, it's lit up like Blackpool illuminations. We hear birds singing at 2 o'clock in the morning now because they're disturbed by the daylight. The earthquakes have been extraordinary. 25 earthquakes around in the last 2 years, and I am absolutely not surprised by the number of ejections there've been.
Are you convinced yourself that it's the drilling that's causing the earthquakes? I don't think there's solid proof on that yet. I mean, I can quite easily see why it might be a suspicion of yours.
There's a 38 Degrees petition out asking for the investigation that the British Geological Survey did to reopen that and reassess, because at the time they were under the impression that no activities were going on at Horse Hill, whereas the Oil and Gas Authority have been able to confirm data saying that there was, it might not be drilling activity, but there were still activities on site that could maybe change the gas pressure underneath when the venting of gas is. So when that first earthquake happened on the 1st of April 2018, the well had been closed in since 2016. If that had just been opened then, you can imagine there could be a huge release of gas there and adjust the pressure under the ground that way. I'm not an expert. It needs experts to look at it, and that's what the petition is calling for.
And just finally, Lisa, do you think that you and other protesters will be able to stop the progress of, say, drilling on that particular site?
It's not just protesters, it's the whole of the locality. We don't want to be another Groningen like in the Netherlands, where they've had 1,500 small earthquakes, but homes have had to be demolished, homes are unsafe, and people are actually living in porta cabins in their gardens because they're not able to gain compensation from the oil and gas companies and the government, who have been found liable for this in the Netherlands.
Okay, Lisa, thank you. Lisa Scott, who lives near the site at Horse Hill. Joining me now is a Professor of Petroleum Geology at the Imperial College in London, and we're going to talk about that next. Professor Richard Selly is with us. Professor, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Now, interestingly, you live in this kind of vicinity, so it's your job, but it's also close to home as well. What do you think about just the kind of the big picture here of having to drill for oil near where people live?
Okay, well, there's an awful lot to say about it. I'll try and be very brief.
Sure.
The Weald has been producing oil and gas for over 100 years. Let me just list the fields: Palmer's Wood, Brockham, Albury, Herriard, Hester's Copse, Goodwood, Stockbridge, Avington, Loma, Horndean, Singleton, Baxter's Copse, Storrington and Heathfield.
Lots of names in there we recognise.
Yeah, I wonder how many people could actually put their fingers on the map and identify those locations. Second point, I hear what's said about the environmental damage. I'd like to pose this question. How would you like to live next to a 1-acre industrial site with daily tanker and heavy good vehicles coming and going 24/7, that emits methane and obnoxious smells, that emits noise and light pollution, that does long-term damage to wildlife, that discharges carcinogens into groundwater and may release pollutants into surface water?
Well, it doesn't sound great on the surface of it. What are you talking about?
A farmyard.
Right. And we got lots of
farmyard
those.
Generates all of those problems. Farmyards, of course, have been around for hundreds of years. An oil field, maybe for about 30.
Okay. There's a thought. I mean, I saw on Twitter, funnily enough, earlier, a kind of promotional video by Shell. Now, Shell are famous for taking oil out the ground and all of that. And they were kind of bigging up their electricity credentials being generated from wind and, I think, solar as well. Definitely wind, because there was a big windmill on this advert. So when you get a big petroleum company moving into renewables, does that show the sort of direction of travel, do you think?
Oh, indeed. I don't have a problem with that at all. We should be moving to renewables. The trick is, how do we get there without crashing the economy? Because if, for some... the Scottish
slow and steady, I would suggest.
Well, exactly. You can't suddenly cut off our natural gas grid, where 80% of the population uses gas for heating and cooking.
Right. So as we move towards that, what's the sensible thing to do? To move the production of oil and gas away from where people live, or do you have to keep it? Well, obviously you've got to do it where the oil and gas is, but does that have to be in residential areas like where we live?
If we're going to be importing gas from Russia, which is now quite likely, that's not very environmentally friendly, because it takes up an awful lot of energy to bring the gas from Russia or to bring the oil from the Middle East or whatever. It's much more sensible to have it in our own backyard, and there are security implications as well.
Yeah.
Could I just address that issue of earthquakes that your previous speaker mentioned?
Yeah.
Most of those earthquakes were not actually recognized, known about by people at the surface. That's using very sensitive instruments. The Oil and Gas Authority held a workshop in October, which they invited about 15 people from all sorts of different organizations, from the Environment Agency to several universities, oil companies, British Geological Survey. And they looked at the issue of the earthquakes The conclusion, the consensus quite clearly was that these were natural. There have been other earthquakes in the area, at Billingshurst, for example. There is the theory advanced by the Edinburgh geologists that the Horse Hill well had overpressured gas at the bottom of it, that the gas escaped into the casing, that the casing failed, the gas got into a fault, and the fault moved. Now, the problem with that is there's no evidence for deep gas, there's no evidence for casing failure, there's no evidence either on the surface or in seismic or in the borehole for a fault.
Okay, so I suppose that the flip side of that, is it worth the risk? If we just don't know for absolute certain, would it be better not to leave the oil under Sussex and Surrey where it is and go for other sources that aren't where people live? I mean, we've had wells in the North Sea for years, haven't we?
Yes, indeed, but that is depleting, and we're now beginning. We have been importing gas from overseas now since the year 2000, and that has a very significant implication for the economy. First of all, we're now losing the tax that those naughty energy companies used to produce for the country, and by having to buy in gas from overseas, it hurts our balance of payments. Okay.
So for your money, what's happening there in Horse Hill and maybe other sites like it under this great big sort of field of oil we have under the Weald, is that likely to increase, do you think?
Well, it could do. It depends on policy.
And
could I very quickly address the climate issue one? I'm a true believer in climate change, and we should be cutting emissions. It's worth pointing out the UK is still the world's fifth largest economy. We emit about 1% of CO2 emissions. If people are really worried about climate change and CO2 emissions, they should be picketing the Indian embassy and the Chinese embassy, because with their coal-fired power stations, they are the countries that are producing most of the climate-changing gases.
Doesn't mean that we shouldn't still try and do more, does it?
Oh, indeed not. No.
We shouldn't sit on our laurels, should we?
No, indeed not.
Okay. As always, fascinating to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Professor Richard Selly, Professor of Petroleum Geology at Imperial College.